The aftermath of Francis's new document, basically breaking down papal primacy, has had some, we'll say, shockwaves sent across the church. And we're going to be very inclusive here in the use of the word the church, because I've seen some odd responses from the Orthodox about this, indifference, if anything, from Protestants. But in general, the responses have been odd. And one thing that we've seen is that some are pointing back to Malachi Martin on this. Because if you've read Windswept House and you manage to get past that really hard to watch scene at the beginning, then you know very well that that book a core theme of that book is the destruction of papal primacy. So we'll talk about that today. Now, if you for some reason did not watch my live stream on this yesterday, and judging from the emails I got in the evening from people who were sending me links to the document asking if I'd seen this when I had streamed about it 12 hours earlier. If you haven't seen, if you're not really aware of this document, I'm going to give you a summary of it before we get into the discussion. But before we even do that, I want to remind you of this story because it's happening today. Christopher Lamb, who writes for The Tablet out of the UK and for his CNN's Catholicism correspondent, we are reminded that today Pope Francis is to meet with a group of comedians at the Vatican today, including Whoopi Goldberg, Jimmy Fallon, Chris Rock, Stephen Colbert, and Conan O'Brien. Stephen at home, who is, I believe, Colbert, but I might be wrong about that, said ahead of the audience, "Am I excited? Is the Pope Catholic?" And the answer to that question is that's an interesting rhetorical question to be asking, because at least in our circles, the question of is the Pope Catholic is one that a lot of people aren't going to answer in the affirmative anymore. But good morning to those of you in the chat. I hope today's audio is a lot better than yesterday. There was a weird technical issue that I had to work through, and I ended up severely upgrading my router yesterday, having a technician over to take care of it to make sure we don't have a repeat like yesterday. One thing after another. But now we go to our main story. From Info Vaticana, this is a summary of the document for those who haven't actually read this. There's a summary here, and then we'll get to the Malachi Martin thing that gives another kind of summary. These are going to be very different, though. The headline from Info Vaticana: the Vatican opens the door to limit the power of the Pope. That's kind of an interesting reading of this. When you look at Orthodox, some Orthodox were doing cartwheels because they're like, we're no longer considered to be in schism. Well, I have thoughts about that because maybe I'll just say it now. You're familiar how the Vatican and Orthodox patriarchs came up with this agreement several years ago where a Catholic could receive the Eucharist at an Orthodox divine liturgy and an Orthodox could receive the Eucharist at a Catholic Mass. And everybody thought that was a great sign of ecumenism and a sign that the rift was healing, all that. In practice, it seems that the Orthodox can have been able to receive the Eucharist at Catholic Masses, but I've never heard of a Catholic who has successfully received the Eucharist at Orthodox divine liturgies, even though I've known many who have been tried and told no, because despite what some of their patriarchs might say, the typical priests and bishops view Catholics as heretics. And it's worth noting here that Fiducia Supplicans was one of the things that basically destroyed ecumenical relations between East and West. So the chance of Rome and the East healing the schism while Fiducia Supplicans stands are next to zero. And the other thing worth noting here is that the Orthodox have gone on the record to say, without any hesitation, that before Fiducia Supplicans, the biggest obstacle was reunification between Rome and the Orthodox was the new Mass. The typical Sunday Mass at most places, because they don't even see it as valid. Okay, so so why they were cheering so much, I don't know. But the idea that they're going to limit the power of the papacy was through the mechanism of synodality and ecumenism. So you'd have these synodal sessions that would not only include the Orthodox, but Protestants too, just like we saw at the Synod of Synodality. If you paid attention to that, you know that there were representatives from various Protestant groups participating at those roundtable discussions on equal footing with Catholic bishops and even with Francis himself, which was scandalous beyond reason. But here we are. So you limit the power of the papacy, sort of. Cardinal Koch ended up coming out later and saying, for a synodal ecumenical church, you still need to have papal primacy. So I don't know what document he read, but this is, there's a lot of ambiguity with this document, which should not surprise anybody. Let's go over the article in brief. This is a comprehensive study document of more than 140 pages that presents for the first time a synthesis of the responses to the encyclical Ut Unum Sint and the ecumenical dialogues on the question of primacy and synodality. The document concludes with a proposal from the dicastery that identifies the most significant questions presented for a renewed exercise of the ministry of unity of the Bishop of Rome, recognized by each and every one. According to the Vatican, the objective of this long document is to find a way of exercising papal primacy that is acceptable to the churches that were in full communion in the first centuries of Christianity. Although not all theological dialogues have addressed the topic with the, come on, stupid pop-ups, with the same depth, some new approaches to the most controversial theological questions have been identified. For anybody who wants to know why I don't use an app to prevent pop-ups, it's because I've had priests tell me that actually using technology to get around advertising on websites and on YouTube is a form of stealing. They've told me that, multiple of them. I know some of you don't think that's true. I've had traditional priests say that they are. One of the achievements of these dialogues has been a renewed reading of the Petrine texts, which have historically been an obstacle for Christian unity. Participants in the dialogues have been challenged to avoid anachronistic interpretations and to reconsider Peter's role among the apostles. That's a fancy way of saying leave the traditional reading of these documents at the door when you have these dialogues and consider what these groups who refuse to submit to the Pope have to say. And I don't mean like the Pope Francis, I mean the Pope regardless of who's sitting there. Could be John Paul II, Pius X, Leo XIII. They object to all of them. A diversity of images and models have been rediscovered in the New Testament. Here's your critical theory. And concepts such as episcope, diaconia, and the Petrine function have helped to better understand the Petrine texts. So again, this is using a condemned hermeneutic here, the critical reading of things, critical history, critical theology, all of it condemned formally by Pope Pius XII in an encyclical. I can't remember which one it was that I've recorded from his, nearly 20-year papacy. It's on the channel if you want to hear it, if you can find it. But he condemned this entire branch of scholarship. This idea of re-examining what the church has always said through a critical new lens, as if 20 centuries removed from the papacy or from the time of Christ, we can better understand things than the fathers of the church did. Very strange idea. Another controversial issue is the Catholic conception of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome as an institution of divine right, while other Christians see it only as a human right. Hermeneutical clarifications have put this dichotomy in new perspective, considering primacy as part of God's will for the church, mediated through human history. Emphasis has been placed on distinguishing between the theological essence and the historical contingency of primacy, evaluating the historical context that has conditioned its exercise in different times. The idea that we reject the idea of Rome as an institution of divine right is essentially a way of trying to get around the idea that the papacy the church was built on the rock of Peter, and that the Pope is essentially the vicar of Christ, and that if he is the vicar of Christ, by logic, you extend loyalty and submission of your will and intellect to him except under extreme circumstances, at least one of which was shown in Scripture itself. But I'm really getting tired of these pop-ups. But it's a way of getting around that, and they try their very best to get around that idea with this document, because you cannot bring old school Protestants back, and you cannot bring the Orthodox back into communion with Rome with papal primacy. They reject it. Of course, then we get to papal infallibility. Dogmatic definitions of the First Vatican Council have been a significant obstacle. They don't like papal infallibility. However, several ecumenical dialogues have advanced by carrying out a rereading of this council, opening new ways to understanding its teaching, also in light of the historical context and Vatican II. The universal jurisdiction of the Pope has been reinterpreted, identifying its extensions and limits, and aspects of the dogma of infallibility have been clarified, recognizing the need for a personal exercise of the ministry of teaching in certain circumstances, since the unity of Christians is a unity in truth and love. Many theological dialogues have recognized the need for primacy at a universal level. and on and on and on, because they do know that there needs to be somebody to play referee on internal debates in the church. But that hasn't helped anyway either, because yes, I know the Anglicans tend to still view the papacy with some fondness and tend to listen to what he has to say, but then they analyze it and consider it within their own needs, often just ignoring him. Whip Tip says, so Bergoglio is getting ready to deliver this final blow to the papacy in the role of Pope as a vicar of Christ. Not surprising. Wayne Talamus says, blocking ads because it pays for the website you're looking at. That's why. That's the logic I've been told by a few priests. Yeah, pays for the website. It's access. It's the way you pay for access to things, and that's what I was told by traditional priests. But this document is clearly an attempt to essentially sell out the papacy for a mess of pottage. Now, if you want to get a bit of a different kind of reading on this, that still does it. This is where we start to get to bring Malachi Martin into this. This is Michael Haynes' Substack, which I didn't even know existed until yesterday when he posted this. But he writes for the LifeSite News, but this is his Substack, which is, I've had people ask me to start a Substack. I'm torn on it for a number of reasons, including like the pay access thing that usually goes with Substack, especially since I already have Patreon and Subscribestar and that kind of thing. But it's a fairly safe place to write longer things. And as you'll see, like Dr. Kwasniewski has a Substack. You care to name a high-profile, fairly mainstream Catholic voice. Kennedy Hall has a Substack. Mainstream in terms of traditional, on the traditional side of things, or traditional adjacent. They'll have something like this. Michael Haynes put his analysis of this up yesterday, and we'll go over a little bit of the document before we go down to the Malachi Martin section, because this is interesting. He says, the headline, Vatican's text on the papacy puts ecumenism and synodality above primacy and signal shift. The text appears to present the blueprint for a new understanding of the papacy and papal primacy in the 21st century, an era marked by a focus on ecumenism and synodality. I want you to remember something. What is Francis's favorite thing to do besides insult traditionalists and to sow confusion on the James Martin sin? What are his favorite things? His favorite thing to invoke is unity. He doesn't go after anything really under the name of unity. In fact, if you read Traditionis Custodes, the underlying logic of why he suppressed Latin masses was because of unity. He thought they were working against the unity of the Church and Vatican II. That's why when you read Traditionis Custodes, the letter that went with it, I mean, that's why it was all about unity. It was actually in the name of unity that he told the Syro-Malabar Catholics in India that they needed to submit to their bishops and actually follow Vatican II. It was in the language and idea of unity is behind all of it. And here he's putting papal primacy, the absolute authority of the Roman pontiff, as secondary to even unity. And it sounds like a contradiction when you think about it, because what is the sign of unity in the church? It is the papacy. It's how you can go to masses that are very, very different in terms of their liturgical tradition. There's something like 24 rites of the mass or something, and you can go to a Melkite mass or Syro-Malabar or Maronite or Byzantine. Their liturgies look very different, but they are all Catholic, and the theology is the same, and the unity of it is to the papacy, amongst other places. But it's like one of the principal things the Pope is supposed to be, and they're sacrificing everything, truth, under this false notion of unity. Because when you start bringing Protestants into this discussion, even and we'll just limit it to the old-fashioned Protestants, not like the weird American ones, but the old-fashioned Protestants who do not agree with us on communion of saints, the perpetual virginity of Our Lady, what the Eucharist is, confession, the number of sacraments. At what point is there a line that you do not cross with in the name of unity? And the document never makes that clear. We'll go to his article and then read for a little context, and then go down to the Malachi Martin part, because the Malachi Martin part is not, supernatural, spooky stuff here. This is the underlying logic of Windswept House that a lot of people miss because of some of the more fiery things in that novel. He says the Vatican has unveiled a pivotal document on the papacy, which contains numerous calls to fundamentally alter the understanding of the practice of papal primacy and authority in order to aid ecumenism and synodality. Titled The Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in the Ecumenical Dialogues, and in responses to the encyclical Ut Unum Sint, the text was launched via a press conference in Rome June 13th. That would be yesterday. There's the papal throne. Billed as the first document to summarize the entire ecumenical debate on the service of primacy in the Church since the Second Vatican Council, the document is the fruit of almost 4 years of, quote, truly ecumenical and synodal work. The text presents the results of a process initiated by the Dicastery for the Promotion of Christian Unity in 2020, which saw the 25th anniversary of Ut Unum Sint. It has been drawn up under the guidance of the Dicastery for the Promotion of Christian Unity and has received input from, quote, Orthodox and Protestant theologians, as well as the Roman Curia and the Synod of Bishops. As such, the text is a study document, not presenting a new line which the Vatican is set to adhere to, at least not yet, but giving a strong indication of probably future direction on the papacy, which may soon emerge partially from the Synod of Synodality. I'm going to pause here. Many of you are concerned about the next conclave, the process for which we elect the next Roman pontiff. Even though Francis may be around another 5 years, another 10 years, possibly, kind of doubt it, but he could be. And such talk of conclaves are almost premature. But if one happens in the next 18 months, the chances of this document, that synodality and the decentralization efforts of synodality and the pressure of ecumenical dialogue in light of this document are going to be very central to those debates. They're going to be at least discussed heavily. And your front runners who emerge from those debates are going to have to answer the question of, are they wanting to take this direction of the papacy, or do they want to cling to the traditional view of the papacy? Now, that might not mean a traditional style or a conservative cardinal on one side and a Bergoglian on the other, along the lines that would, on the surface, make sense. After all, what if in the debate at the next conclave emerges, you have two candidates who get the most support in the final run for to be the Pope, to replace Francis, and one basically thinks the church is ready to go in this direction, but the other wants to use papal power to finish the job? Again, we are talking about a situation where 75% of the cardinals in the College of Cardinals who will be participating have been replaced by Francis, and there will absolutely be a consistory at some point this year. Too many cardinals have already retired. There are now enough retirements and resignations have happened since the last consistory, the process to name new cardinals, where there are now not enough cardinals to meet the required number for a conclave. So they're going to have one. They're just going to. But he continues saying, as with many elements of the Catholic Church today, ecumenism is at the fore. The Dicastery summarized that following Vatican II, the ecumenical dimension of the papacy has been an essential aspect of this ministry. Writing his preface to the document, Cardinal Kirk Koch noted that, quote, it is our hope that it will promote not only the reception of the dialogues on this important topic, the papacy, but also stimulate further theological investigation and practical suggestions, together, of course, for an exercise of the ministry of unity of the Bishop of Rome, recognized by all concerned. Indeed, the document appears to present the blueprint for a new understanding of the papacy and papal primacy in the 21st century, an era marked by a focus on ecumenism and synodality. As noted in the document itself, it offers a schematic presentation of the responses to John Paul II's document, the main theological questions traditionally challenging papal primacy, some perspectives for a ministry of unity in a reunited church, and practical suggestions or requests addressed to the Catholic Church. And this involved Protestant theologians and Orthodox theologians. And this is where we get to Windswept House. Malachi Martin's novel, the one that most people read. I highly recommend that before you read this book, you read a novel of his called Vatican, because it begins with a little bit in the year 1870 and then fast forwards to 1944, 1945 at the end of World War II. And then it picks up and covers virtually every single nasty headline that the church ever dealt with, and written in the same manner as Windswept House. The main players are all real people in that novel, just like this one, and they have been renamed, but they're very easy to identify. But the main theme in both of those novels is an attack on the actual primacy of the Roman pontiff. But with Windswept House, it picks up almost where where Vatican leaves off, except Vatican was written more in the early 80s. And in Malachi Martin sort of assumed that John Paul II would make it to the end of the 1980s, given the attempt on him made earlier in the decade. But Windswept House picks up pretty much where it leaves off, except that John Paul II is very much alive and well in that book. And it's, except now you have the sort of the darker forces in the world converging on them. And there's the part everybody knows about that book, the evil ritual towards the beginning, that's very hard to read. And a lot of people can't get past that part for good reason. But the theme of both of those books is the weakening of the papacy, this attempt to destroy the primacy of the Roman pontiff, to put him on a level with the same level as the bishops in the collective body, which almost is like a reading that the Orthodox would prefer themselves of the Roman pontiff. And we've seen this in real life. Like I said, those novels are based, like 95% of it is actually real and true. We've seen these things proposed before, mostly during Benedict XVI's time. It's weird how those discussions suddenly went away when the modernists got a pope that they liked. Once they completely on board, they got one completely on board with what they want to do. All the talk of weakening papal power suddenly went by the wayside. But that is that is the key to that novel. And it's understanding that you see that he's been proven right, because this document is clearly intended to lay the groundwork for a future pope, or maybe Francis if he's around long enough, to ensure that in the future the papacy and the theology around the papacy won't be a stumbling block to our so-called separated brethren, to borrow lines from Vatican II itself. So here's what he has to say on this. The document's theologians' arguments and essays are followed by a summary along with, quote, of practical suggestions or requests addressed to the Catholic Church regarding the future exercise of the office of the papacy. As with other elements of current ecclesial life, the text bears a peculiar resemblance to Malachi Martin's Windswept House, in which the people worldwide who run everything and the stone-cutter-aligned cardinals are attempting to force John Paul II, it's what they call him in the novel because everybody's got a different name, to resign through using the argument that for him to do so would help the damaged unity of the Church and improve the relations between the heterodox bishops and the Pope. Though not aimed at forcing Pope Francis to resign, since he has approved the text of the Bishop of Rome and ordered its promulgation, the document's text appears aimed at changing the papacy generally, not at any pope in particular. The principles for the exercise of primacy in the 21st century present a change in understanding of the papacy, which would be at the service of ecumenism, synodality, the text outlines. Papal primacy should be intimately linked with synodality, the current wave of thought sweeping through the Church and the instigation of Pope Francis. At first, general agreement is the mutual interdependency of primacy and synodality at each level of the Church, and the consequent requirement for synodal exercise of the primacy. And this is why I brought up collegiality and conciliarism yesterday in my live stream on this. It's the elevation of the bishops to the same level as the Pope. Formally condemned idea, there was an attempt to implement that and institutionalize that at Vatican II, but Paul VI put the brakes on that as best he could. But in practice since then, popes have been generally pretty weak since Vatican II. I know it might be surprising to hear some people say, but the reports are from Benedict XVI that he had a meeting with, maybe it was Father Nicholas Gruner, who asked him this question, who said, Holy Father, why is it that we have been trying to write to your office letting you know about a lot of these Ted McCarrick type priests in the priesthood and how a lot of bishops are hiding all these things and they're preaching heresy from the pulpit. We've been trying to get your attention on this. And Benedict reportedly pointed his finger at the door and said, my authority ends at that door. My mail is read and intercepted by people. In other words, it was the first he had heard about it. Give you some ideas here about the weakening of the papacy in a de facto sense. This almost institutionalizes it, though. And that is what the document really is about, is weakening the primacy of the Roman pontiff. And that is the underlying theme of Malachi Martin's book, except in his book, the reason for it was very different than this on the surface. In his novel, this was all being instigated by economic elites, industry titans, European Union political figures, those kinds of people. There was an American in the novel. They were the ones pushing for this. And on the surface, that sounds like it's a very different driver for this. But I want to remind you of something. This is nothing new either. Francis has inexplicably tied to this. I made a note here. I'll just read you this note. I was getting ready for this. You say, in Windswept House, the weakening of the primacy of the papacy was pushed by secularists to advantage the creation of a new integrated Europe, what we call today the European Union. The actors in that novel all had fictitious names, but were real people, some of which are still active in European politics today, and I can't say some of their names on YouTube. To give you an idea. 30 years after the book was released. I'll give you one. I won't say his name. He recently resigned from that economic roundtable group, we'll say, that claims to speak for issues for everybody around the world. The guy who dresses like a Star Trek villain. That guy just resigned. He is named in that book. He has a different name, but he is a character in that book, and people figured it out real quick. There's a key to these characters there. You see, he says, early in the novel, we are treated to a conversation between the secular figures behind the scenes where they discuss either getting rid or getting John Paul II to go along with their scheme to weaken the papal office in the name of the European power, essentially, or they force him to resign. It's been noted that Windswept House, along with another book of his called The Final Conclave, detail behind the scenes schemes to weaken the papacy that have come to pass. And we could add Vatican to that one as well. The forced resignation of pontiffs, mechanisms for ensuring that pontiffs moving forward are of like mind with the secular authorities, that sort of thing. Read in the light of Benedict XVI's resignation, those books are absolutely spooky in their predictive power. Read in the light in the new document by Francis yesterday, they get even weirder. One such weakening of papal power in that book was to have the European bishops directly tied to European lawmakers to ensure that they would be loyal to the secular authorities over the Pope. Read in light of the German bishops in their heretical, schismatic German synodal way, you can see Malachi Martin being proven right without getting even into this document. And you read this document into it, synodality, where the bishops can meet with the Pope, and priests can, and laity can, and the Orthodox representatives of the Orthodox Church can, and Protestants can, handpicked, of course, but all on an equal level. And you begin to see how even the secular authorities can get their fingerprints into this and how they can push things along. The German synodal way is a great example of what was going on in Windswept House, because in Germany they have the church tax, and the German bishops clearly, like you saw the European political contest recently, that made a lot of headlines. If you watch American political commentary, they all talked about the results of it. Reading the German news outlets in my research just for my normal videos on this channel, I couldn't help but notice that all of their media were working with the bishops of Germany, trying to get people to reject what ended up happening. Inseparably. It's all part of the same thing. Synodality has the fingerprints of the secular authorities all over it. You weaken the primacy of the papacy, you weaken the resistance to what they're doing. And then to get even more into the weeds a little bit, if you want to, in terms of prophecy and that kind of thing, you're aware of the concept of the catechon. A lot of people have suggested that Benedict XVI was the catechon. I think he was a kind of catechon, but not the catechon. The catechon is the restrainer against the rise of the Antichrist. You weaken the papacy, you weaken the ability to restrain these things. It's, I don't think, a coincidence that once the church in the 60s formally said we're opening the windows of the church to the world to let some fresh air in, the ideas of the secular world in an effort to be more relevant, basically, that things went off the rails. And it hasn't gotten better. The world is a very strange place since the 1960s. Could be just chalk it up as a bad timing on the church's part. You know, that you do that, and then by the end of the 60s, everything had been flipped upside down. You could make that case, I guess, but you're here looking at this as the effect of weakening the papacy and the concept of the catechon and the concept of the church itself as a restrainer. This document it gives a lot of food for thought if you really want to dive deep into these kinds of things. Willis says we need a Charlemagne and a Gregory the Great. Well, Catholic prophecy says you're going to get an angelic pontiff and a great monarch out of Europe who will restore order after the chastisement. So if you make it through that long, who knows? But that may not happen in our lifetime. Now I'm going to give you a more moderate take here, because as we wrap up, and this comes from Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. He wants to remind everybody that this document does not have any binding power. Francis can't do this by himself, so we shouldn't worry. My response to that is, Has that stopped him before? So this is laying the groundwork for future work, though. And they wouldn't have spent 4 years and who knows how much money behind this, because people forget that these documents where they're reaching out to Protestant theologians, Orthodox theologians, and bishops and things from across the church, spending years on this. There's a lot of money that went into this. So here's Peter Kwasniewski on this. I think it is worth reading as a voice of moderation on this, especially since we were starting to get to the catechon and prophecy and things. He says, concerning the document just released by the Dicastery for promoting Christian unity, the Bishop of Rome, primacy and synodality in the ecumenical dialogues and responses to the encyclical Ut Unum Sint. 1. Everyone, this is not a magisterial document. It says on page 1, the status of the text is that of a study document that does not claim to exhaust the subject nor to summarize the Catholic magisterium on it. Its purpose is to offer an objective synthesis of recent ecumenical developments on the theme, thus reflecting the insights but also the limitation of the dialogue documents themselves. We are now happy to publish this study document with the agreement of His Holiness Pope Francis. So he then says, so if you are interested in ecclesiology, papacy, and ecumenical dialogue, by all means sit back and enjoy or not, but do not let yourself be disturbed by any internet personalities, whether trad or anti-trad, who make a big deal of this text. It's simply not a big deal as to its status or genre. It's like a grandiose working paper for a discussion group. I will just interject here and say working papers for discussion groups tend to, in the church, bear fruit eventually. I don't think anybody is saying that Francis just destroyed the papacy with this, that this is opening the door for some chaos down the road. 2, those who know his work, from Benedict's Peace to Francis's War, etc., know that I am all in favor of historical accuracy and theological modesty concerning the office of the papacy, in order to smooth the path toward the reunion of all Christians around the chair of Peter. Nevertheless, we must recognize some hard facts. A, as long as some popes behave contemptuously towards a venerable tradition of their own right, church and towards the faithful who love it, and even defend this behavior as consistent with this Petrine office, the Eastern Orthodox would not seriously consider placing themselves under a tyranny that could just as easily turn against any subject of the Roman See depending on the prejudices of the day. That is true, by the way. I touched on that when we started. Put more positively, the necessary minimum condition for reunion with the East is a repudiation of the mentality of rupture with tradition that has infected the West, particularly since the last council. Again, I hinted at that by telling you that fiducia supplicans was a big barrier, but also the Orthodox have been very public about saying they don't even view the new Mass as valid. And so they think it's heretical. And by extension, they think we're all heretics because of it. So until what he says that in a much nicer way than I did, until that is addressed, he's right. The East will not even consider reunification. B, as long as some popes behave contemptuously even towards divine revelation by teaching contrary to the patristically and magisterially accepted meaning of many passages of Scripture, serious Protestants will not be able to place themselves under one whom they must regard as a rebel against the Word of God. Again, what will be necessary is a manifestation of utmost humility on the part of a future pope, in solemnly confirming and then concretely abiding by the premise of De Verbum that the magisterium is not superior to the Word of God, but is only its servant. Examples include biblical teaching on idolatry, salvation in Christ alone, breaking your marriage vows, the James Barton sin, family, hierarchy, and of course the ultimate penalty the state can impose. That Francis has contradicted the church on those things. In short, now is the least propitious time imaginable to propose reunion around the chair of Peter, whose incumbent has made it seem like a sea of pestilence instead of witnessed apostolic tradition and divine revelation. That's a nice flourish of words from Dr. Kwasniewski there. I'm going to have to remember that term, sea of pestilence. I put my trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, the eternal head of the church, that he will raise up for us a pope or several popes after his own heart, who will set to rights the chaos of the post-conciliar period and lead the church on earth back into harmony with its own inheritance of liturgy, theology, and law. Until then, Cardinal Koch and other well-intentioned ecumenists can schedule meetings and publish study documents, but these will not be capable of removing the fundamental impediments to reunion. What is really required is an existential conversion of kenotic humility on the part of future popes who choose visibly to reinsert themselves into the bimillennial arc of Catholic tradition. And then he has a link to the actual document itself. I have links to all this stuff in my show notes at returntotradition.org at the end of this live stream. I'm not prepared to dismiss this document as quickly as he is. I would just caution people that this stuff is now out in the open, endorsed by Francis. and being promoted by all the synodalists. And if it should be taken seriously as we march down the path towards synodality, whether we like it or not. Raymond says, my question boils down to this. Of course, the teachings about the papacy stand full stop. I'll wait till I'll revisit you when you get your question completely formulated, Raymond. But Bishop Rome here, Bishop Rome there. Suddenly I recall that Argentinian statue struck by lightning, leaving it without the hand and the keys. Yes, that picture was circulating yesterday on Twitter. Interesting how that works, isn't it? That lightning strike was on Francis's birthday in a diocese not far from his own diocese, and the keys in the crown the keys in the halo of St. Peter were struck by lightning. And I was in contact with somebody in Argentina who actually went and visited the place to make sure that pictures were real, and they were very real. And this gives it some more interesting context. Raymond asks, does the ape of the church have anything to do with selecting a pope? I mean, yeah, the St. Gallen group has been meeting. I've reported this in the past. The St. Gallen group has been meeting behind the scenes as we speak to prepare for the next conclave. The other side has too. That's why you got those Demos documents. But the St. Gallen group has been meeting in St. Gallen, Switzerland. And they've let slip that what they're looking for is a pope who is on the same page with him, like Francis, but can be much more easily controlled than he was. Because the one thing you can say about Francis is that he doesn't like to be hedged in. He doesn't like to be controlled by anybody. So they're looking for somebody ideologically similar, but somebody that they can control. And that's why I keep looking at Tagle and wondering if that's who they're going to push. Or Hollerich. Neither of them strike me as normally papal material in terms of being able to lead and not be controlled, but have people who behind the scenes rein the person in. They do strike me as good contenders, even if on paper they're not the most pop-a-billy person you've ever seen. All right. Any final thoughts here? The keys catechon have returned to Christ. I don't know. I don't think Francis is the last one. The last people I think are really clinging to the idea that Francis is the last pope. I don't think so. I tend to think Father Heimerl's reading of the St. Malachi prophecy is probably the best reading I've ever seen of it. I do suggest people take it seriously. His reading gives us like 4 or 5 more popes after this. But if there's any final comments, please get them in the chat. And otherwise, we will wrap this up. I will here soon have everything up on returntotradition.org so you can read these articles and things for yourself. All right, folks. Yeah, the Tooth Twister reminds us that Pope is apparently going to go travel to that city sooner or later. That trip keeps getting canceled, but I know he wants to. Joe reminds us that Tagle likes to dance around with the World Youth Day participants. It could probably easily be manipulated. Yeah, that's why I keep looking at him. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. And yeah, we yesterday's audio issue was a technical issue. I upgraded. I actually have a business class modem now, so this shouldn't be a problem anymore. It's like the modem you'd put in a Starbucks. Okay, that's what I have now, sitting 7 feet from where I'm sitting right now. So this shouldn't be a problem anymore. Thanks very much for tuning in today. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.